Bueno, queridos docentes, antes que nada, muchas gracias por su puntualidad. Eh, Creo que vamos a comenzar en punto a las 4. Hoy no vamos a dar tiempo para respetar el tiempo de Kerry, quien va a orientar el panel el día de hoy. Espero que le hagan muchas preguntas porque es el momento para hacerlas. Bienvenidos nuevamente. Para los docentes que tienen dudas, por supuesto, eh, esto va a quedar grabado. Entonces, nada, bienvenidos, los dejo en manos de Kerry y voy a estar también acompañándolos como asistente a este webinar informativo.
Okay, muchas gracias, Felipe. Buenas tardes a todos. Now I'm going to change to English because you are all English teachers and soon you'll be traveling to the US to study and learn about different teaching techniques. Once again, my name is Carrie O'Brien. I'm the Education USA advisor at the Fulbright Commission, and I will be giving today's webinar. So thank you for being punctual and thank you for attending. I'm going to give a presentation about culture shock and tips for studying in the US. And as always, please feel free to ask questions via the chat function of this webinar. And at the end of my presentation, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So actually, first I have a question for those of you who are logged in, who participate. My question for you is, what is culture? How would you define culture? What is your understanding of the definition of culture and how would you define it? So maybe if you could take one moment and chat in some ideas about what is culture, and then I'll read a few examples. Okay, so the first response we got is from Edgar, and he said, do you think we will really experience culture shock with a 3-week stay in the US? And my response is yes. You can experience culture shock even being in Colombia, interacting with someone from another country. So it's important just to know a little bit about what it is, how to cope with it, what can be learned, and yes, I think you will be surprised at how much culture shock you can experience within 3 weeks, especially during a presidential election. Now I see some of you are sending me chats about how you would define culture. So I see someone says, for me, culture is what identifies a group and makes it different from others. Culture is everything related to people, life, traditions, and ways of living together, rules, all aspects that define a certain group of people, the set of manifestations of human beings in any region or country, what people share. Culture is the way a specific community interacts with others. Great. These are all really great responses, and thank you for participating. So here we have one definition of culture on the screen. Culture is the learned and shared human patterns or models for living, the day-to-day living patterns. So these patterns and models pervade all aspects of human social interaction. It is mankind's primary adaptive mechanism. So this is one definition. I'm sure there are many other ways to define culture, but here's one. And once again, they're learned and shared human patterns or models for living. One of you said culture could be the rules, so it's a set of norms and rules as well. I like to use this picture when I talk about culture because it is like an iceberg. So on the top of the iceberg that's above the water, you see visible behavior. And below the surface, there's a lot more going on that you can't see. Those could be the beliefs, the norms, or the values that influence the visible behavior. So I'm not sure, maybe some of you have already seen this visual, but for me it really helps to understand how complex a culture can really be. And it's so much more than what meets the eye. And you always have to kind of dissect what's going on when you're experiencing another culture and try to understand the behaviors and what kind of beliefs, norms, and values are influencing those cultural behaviors. Let's take another break to chat in some ideas. What do you think would be some examples of visible behaviors in Colombian culture? And what are the beliefs, norms, or values behind those behaviors? You could make it as simple as you want, but give me some examples using Colombian culture. Okay, so some of you are sending me examples of visible behavior in Colombian culture. You love having parties. You are outgoing and spontaneous. You touch each other when you're talking and having a conversation. You're happy. You make jokes. You make greetings when you enter a room. So those are the visible behaviors. How do you think, what do you think is behind those visible behaviors? What are the beliefs or the values that influence those behaviors? Why do you think Colombians find it important to greet someone when they enter a room? I will add that someone just chatted in. Unfortunately, I have to acknowledge that most Colombians tend to arrive a little late and tend to complain a lot about everything. Well, so I think let's take the example of arriving late. So I think the visible behavior, sure, it looks like someone is arriving late, and maybe in US culture that might be considered rude, but in Colombian culture, the beliefs and the values behind that are that maybe they were having a really important conversation with someone previously, and they didn't want to be rude to the person they were with, right? So it's all depending on how you frame it. So in Colombian culture, although it's common to arrive late, it's because of a belief or a value of not wanting to interrupt a conversation that you're having to leave early and arrive on time to your next meeting. So that could be one example. On this slide, we have something called the cultural adjustment curve. And it looks like a roller coaster for a reason, because depending on how long you are, adjusting to a different culture, and someone did point out 3 weeks is a short time, but I think you could still find yourself going through these phases. You could have a honeymoon phase when you arrive to a new culture. You love everything about it. You love learning about it. You're excited to be there, excited to be traveling, and then suddenly maybe you'll have a conflict or some sort of culture shock in trying to communicate with someone within that culture, maybe with someone you're living with or someone you're working with. You have some sort of conflict between the two different cultures at hand. Then there's something. I'm sorry. So then there's something called the recovery period after that conflict and culture shock. You'll start to recover and learn ways to adjust and cope with that shock. And you'll probably enter the honeymoon phase again, which means you're really happy, you're loving it, and something will happen again, and you'll have another conflict, recover, and adjust. So it's completely normal to go through phases like this when you're entering another culture. And it's important to mention as well that there's a reverse culture shock when you return to your native culture. So maybe you'll find at the end of the 3 weeks you started adjusting to the culture in Davis, California, and then suddenly you're going to come back to Colombia and adjust to your native culture again. So keep in mind that this is a very, very normal part of the process. And as long as you know to expect it, then you can cope with it much better. Here we have some general signs and symptoms of culture shock, and this is not meant to worry you or scare you, but rather to show you the range of physical and mental effects that culture shock could have. And it varies depending on the person, it varies depending on the situation. So it's not to say that you'll have any of these symptoms or all of these symptoms, but it's just so that you have an awareness of how culture shock can actually manifest both physically and mentally. So in cases of homesickness, you might spend excessive amounts of time alone or reading or kind of isolating yourself, missing your host country or your native country. Or on the really intense side of it, you might start compulsive drinking to forget about being homesick. Again, these are just examples, but take a look at this chart. And I will also share this presentation as a PDF file with Felipe so he can share this with you. The great part about your experience is that you're going as a group and you're participating in this exchange program as a group. So you can, have a network to lean on if you're really homesick. You can talk to each other about your culture shock experiences, and it's really nice that you'll be a part of a group that's going together. Now, here are some tips for dealing with culture shock. And I'm going to be sharing with you many different lists of advice for preparing for your experience, and this comes from a book that I will show you at the end of the presentation. So the tips for dealing with culture shock are: assume differences until similarity is proven. So remember, you're going into a completely different culture, and you should never assume that the culture is exactly the same as yours. So it's better to assume things will be different and be surprised, maybe pleasantly surprised at how there are similarities. Relate to individuals, not a culture. So in these 3 weeks, I'm sure you're going to make friendships and you're going to meet a lot of different individuals and really hear about their experiences and learn about their culture. So make sure that you're really making friends and relating to individuals. You want to work with a culture rather than against it. So try to learn about the culture and try new things. Don't push firmly against adapting to a culture. Just try to absorb it and enjoy the process rather than fighting against it and saying things like, well, in my country we do it this way. That's obviously a very bad attitude to take on and not recommendable. Ask yourself, what do I need to understand? Not what should I do? So you always want to frame it from a place of understanding, and maybe you'll have some difficulty with your teachers or with the people that you're living with if you're living with a host family. So don't be so reactive, but think a little bit more about what you need to understand about different behaviors and what is influencing the culture that you are experiencing. And of course, focus on the benefits of the differences rather than trying to avoid mistakes within the culture. So you can laugh about it. If you see there are big differences between US and Colombian culture, focus on the benefits of the differences and sharing these experiences rather than considering it as a problem. Here are the top 10 tips for immersing yourself in the culture. So preparation is key. Make sure you do some preparation in terms of understanding the culture that you will be entering. Request cross-cultural training, which is what we're doing right now. Seek out others who have gone before you. So remember that a group did go last year and they did the same exact program in the same exact city. Maybe they even stayed with some of the same families. So you could potentially seek out people who participated in the program last year or other friends that have participated in exchange programs in other countries to get some of their advice. Of course, embrace your new home and your new friends. So it's a very short amount of time, but I think you will still have enough time to make new friends, especially staying with host families. Make sure you take advantage of the opportunity and you explore your neighborhood, your campus, the public transportation. Take advantage of all of the resources available at UC Davis because U.S. university campuses have many, many, many free events and resources. So make sure you take the time to find out what is available to you and take advantage of all of those resources. Serve as a cultural ambassador. So remember that you're representing Colombia and people will be asking you questions, I'm sure, about your own culture. So prepare yourself for that. Be ready to represent your country and answer some questions for people who might not know anything about Colombia or Colombian culture. Recognize the signs of culture shock and how to deal with it. So again, now you have all of that information and I will share the presentation with you later. Don't be too hard on yourself if you make mistakes. Pay attention and listen carefully to what people are saying so that there's no misunderstandings, and enjoy the experience. Don't take anything too seriously. Top 10 tips for staying safe while studying abroad. Again, this comes from the book that I will share with you at the end of the presentation, and I will share with all of you the PDF file of the entire book where this information is coming from. So make sure you take any health and safety precautions before you leave the country. If you have any sort of health issues, make sure that you see a doctor before you leave, you get all the medication you need to take with you, things like that. Familiarize yourself with the local laws, and obviously don't break them. Practice smart safety always. Don't put yourself in dangerous or risky situations. Get to know your neighborhood and locate the necessities like banks, food, stores, hospitals, post office, laundry, internet cafe, and your contacts at UC Davis and your host families will be key in finding out all of this information. They will be there to help you get acquainted with everything in your neighborhood. Stay healthy by, having a routine, some sort of routine, making sure you're eating healthy and getting some exercise, sleeping enough. Use your common sense, stay calm, stay informed about local news, especially in this time when we're coming up on a presidential election. It's important to stay informed. And in general, it's just important to watch the local news as much as you can, read the local newspaper. Protect yourself against petty theft and pickpockets. And if anything does happen, make sure you seek, professional assistance, which will be available to you throughout the entire experience at UC Davis. Another top 10, this one is for preparing for your trip. So some of these are more relevant than others. For example, complete your application. Well, in this case, you've already applied and been selected to participate in the program. Secure your necessary documentation. Felipe is helping you with all of that. Confirm your travel plans. Take care of personal and financial business. Take care of your health, like I mentioned in the previous slide. Think globally. Become familiar with your new country before you leave. read up about the culture, read up about current events, make sure you understand where you're going. Plan to keep a journal or a blog, especially because I'm sure the people who are sponsoring this program will want to hear in detail about your experience, and you'll be so busy each day you may forget certain details, so it would be a great idea to keep a journal. And of course, pack wisely. Here's another list with some packing tips. Make a checklist to be sure you don't forget anything, and be prepared to edit down that checklist. So what you might have originally will hopefully become smaller and smaller as you realize the limitations for your luggage allowance. Pack only what you can carry. Don't pack valuables in your checked luggage. So remember, you shouldn't be traveling with anything too valuable, and if you are, you should travel with that in your hand luggage. Nothing valuable should go in your checked luggage. For example, if you're going to bring a digital camera, I recommend you bring it either in your purse or your backpack or your hand luggage. Attach a sturdy ID to your luggage, something that has your name, your contact information, so in case your luggage is lost, they can find you. I recommend putting some sort of colorful detail on the outside of your luggage so it's easy to identify on the luggage belt, especially if you all go in a big group. It will be really helpful to distinguish your luggage in some way. And remember to check your airline's baggage limitations. Great, so here are the resources. So the first resource is the book called A Student Guide to Study Abroad, and I will be sharing the PDF version with you of the entire book. The book is directed at US students going to other countries to study abroad, but it has very relevant advice that applies to anyone who's participating in an exchange program. And the other links are different information about making the most out of studying abroad, what I wish I knew before studying in the US, travel in the USA in case any of you plan to extend your stay and travel, and 4 different things that you need while traveling in the USA. So you can look at these links later when you have the PDF version of the presentation. And thank you for listening. Now I will give you guys a few minutes to chat your questions. Okay, so I'm receiving some questions and I'll just go down the list answering them. One person asked, how do you think the presidential elections will affect you as a group? Well, I don't think it will have too much of a direct effect because you have a quick 3-week program. But what is very interesting, and you should take advantage of this experience, is that you will be in the US during a very, historic presidential election. So make sure you're, keeping aware of the news and monitoring all of the activities going on. But I don't think it will have a very direct effect, but rather it's an opportunity for you to see what it's like to be in the US during such a historic moment in a historic election. Someone else said, I went to the USA some years ago and was frustrated because I couldn't make any American friends since they were not so open to talk to strangers. How can I get past that barrier? That's a good question. Well, I think you'll have some things working in your favor this time because you're participating in a program as a group and you're going to have a lot of activities scheduled for you. And having a little bit more of a structure to meet people, for example, through your university activities or through your host families, you'll have more likelihood, more probability of entering the inner circle with some of the U.S. citizens that you'll meet. So it's true, I think it takes longer to break the ice with someone from the U.S. Colombians are very, very friendly, so that will work to your advantage. But I think participating in different group activities, joining clubs, finding common interests is a way that can help you to become friends with more North Americans. Someone is asking if they can bring canned food in their luggage, and I would say I really advise against it unless it's a health issue that you have. But considering it will only be 3 weeks that you're in the US, I advise that you try some local cuisine, and also it's going to be very heavy to travel with canned food in your luggage. So in addition to that, you'll have problems with your immigration process into the States. Customs will likely confiscate different products that you have if they're food products. So try to avoid it, but if you have some sort of medical situation, then maybe ask us a follow-up question later. Someone asked, what can be considered an offensive act for a North American? Well, we probably have the stereotype that we're offended by everything, which I'm from the US and I don't think it applies for every single person there, but you do have to be a little more cautious with certain things. For example, maybe North Americans aren't as used to touching the person they're talking to so much, or even the greeting when you walk into a room and you give someone a kiss. Those sort of things are not part of US culture. So depending on the person, many people have traveled and understand their cultures outside of their own, so they won't be offended necessarily. But I would say just be cautious with any kind of like physical contact that you have, or even for the guys, for Colombian guys, I'd say be cautious about how you compliment women, because it could maybe be misconstrued to be too flirtatious or inappropriate. So, and just remember, it's important to always explain how your culture is and learn about how the US culture is through individual interactions. What is the best way to solve a problem or a discussion if we have one there in the US? So I think always go back to that visual of the iceberg that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. If you're having some sort of misunderstanding or conflict with someone in another culture, it's really a good idea to reflect and try to understand what is below the surface, so that it's not simply just visible behaviors and actions, but there are values beneath those actions. You might even be surprised that those same values are beneath these very different visible behaviors. So for example, if a Colombian arrives late to a meeting in the US and the US citizen gets very offended, um, their behaviors look very different, but the values behind their actions are quite similar, which is that they want to show respect for people. The only difference is maybe a Colombian prioritizes showing respect with the person they're with in that moment. So they arrive late to the next meeting because they were respectful to the person in the previous meeting. So, but maybe the US citizen left a meeting early and disrespected the person they were with to arrive on time punctually to the following meeting. So uh, in those sort of situations, it's important to talk about the values beneath the actions and don't overreact, of course. Someone has asked, will there be any specific rules with my host family? This will depend on the family that you stay with. So I think it's good when you are first meeting them and having, your first meal with them to clarify and establish any rules of the house. So that will depend on the family you stay with.
We will also have a webinar with uh, Tina Castillo, and she knows a lot about that. And also remember what the teacher Chiribi just told us when we were here for the visa appointment. So it depends on the family. It really depends on the family.
Okay, others are asking about what kind of materials to take with you in your luggage. Do you need to bring books, notebooks, or other resources? You should bring digital materials so you don't fill your suitcase with heavy books or other materials. Everything that you bring should be on a USB and should be some digital materials. If you need to make copies of some of the books or scan some of the materials that you use, I recommend doing that. Another person is asking about what kind of clothing to bring. Will it be cold? Fall could be a little bit cold in Davis, California, so you should pack layers, different layers, and a jacket. Remember also that you have a manual, and in your manual it gives you some advice about what to pack. Is it a good idea to bring a present to our hosts? Yes, 100%. It doesn't have to be expensive. And it shouldn't weigh very much, but it's always a nice gesture to bring a small symbol of appreciation for the fact that they are hosting you for these 3 weeks. So I recommend finding something very symbolic of Colombia, maybe maybe a different kind of hat from Colombia or some treats, some coffee candy, something like that. That's not going to cost a lot or weigh a lot. Someone asked about if I have any tips academically speaking as far as your experience going into the US education system. And I think, well, Tina, when she gives her presentation on behalf of UC Davis, will have more information. But in general, I think, you're expected to participate in class. You're expected to ask questions to your professor, to give your opinions, to really be participating in class. And another thing, which they call at universities academic integrity many times, is about like the ethics behind all of the work that you do for the class and making sure nothing is plagiarized, or if you're citing from a book, for example, or if you're borrowing a quote from somewhere, that at the bottom of your paper you're citing your sources. So be very diligent about citing any source that you use to create any project while you're in the US, and make sure you participate in class. Some of you are asking if you'll have a close person to talk to if there's any problems. Well, yes, it's in your manual that you have, and you'll have contacts at the university. So you'll know before you leave you need to talk to if there are any problems. Make sure you revise your manual. I got a question about religious beliefs. So this could vary. There are many different religions in the US, and at times it can be a taboo topic because people are a little more private about their religion in the US. However, as with many, many things, it will depend on who you're talking to, what their background is. So I just say err on the side of being a little conservative when talking about religion, because you don't want to offend anyone. If you're interested in finding any kind of church nearby the university itself will have information about what is the closest church you can attend. Does anyone have additional questions for now? Okay, someone asked, is it advisable to talk to my host family all the time, telling them where I am and what I am doing? Again, I think you should establish the expectations on your first day or two with your family. It depends on who they are. I highly doubt they're going to be very intense with you. They know that you're adults and you can take care of yourself. But I'm sure they would like to know, if you're going to be home very, very late one night or something like that, so they don't have to worry about you. Just think about what you would want if you were in their situation, and also clarify the expectations and any house rules on your first day or two when you get there. Someone expressed they're worried about food. I think, it will be very different than what you're used to in Colombia, but there are so many different options. You can buy food at the grocery store and cook for yourself, worst case scenario. So remember, you'll have access to a kitchen, and if you have any issues. The good thing is that there is such a variety that you should be able to find something healthy that you like. Maybe the juice won't taste as delicious there, but you'll find good options. Another person asked about Veterans Day because you'll be there during Veterans Day, which is a national holiday. I will provide Felipe with maybe some information about that holiday, and I'm sure the university will also have some sort of activity, optional activity for you, or suggestions of how you could spend that day off. So we'll follow up with you with information about that. Can we do different activities on Sundays, or do we have to stay with our host families? Are there any restrictions? There are really, you're not expected to spend every moment with your host family. If they invite you to do some activity and you're interested, of course, that's great. But there's no rule that you have to spend every weekend with them. And I'm sure they will understand that you want to see as much of, the U.S. as possible. So you can talk to them about that. But it's not expected that you spend every moment with your host family. Someone asked about a farmer's market. What is a farmer's market? I'm sure you'll be able to find one nearby where you're staying. You can ask your host family. Basically, that's an opportunity to find fresh produce, fresh fruits and vegetables at a lower price. So that's something you can ask the locals, because I've actually never been to Davis, California, but they are very common in the US. So hopefully you find a good farmer's market and can buy some fresh fruits and vegetables. Another person asked if you need vaccines. That will be discussed in a upcoming webinar with United Airlines, and they'll tell you if you need any vaccines. One person asked, will everyone be living in Davis, California? Not necessarily, but everyone will be living very close to the university. So it might not necessarily be in Davis, but it will be in very surrounding close cities. Stay tuned for more information about where you will be staying, but it will be located very close to the university. We'll take one more question and then finish today's webinar. Does anyone have one more question? Okay, the last question that we'll answer for today is, are we going to interact with students at schools? There will be classroom observations. You won't necessarily be interacting very much, but rather observing how the teaching is happening at the schools that you're visiting. So they will be observations, but not very much interaction. And that's the last question I'll answer for today. I will provide this presentation as a PDF document to Felipe, as well as the PDF version of the book that I was referencing, so that you have some useful resources to prepare for your experience. So thank you again for attending. Thank you for all the good questions. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a great time in Davis. Thank you, Felipe, for the invitation.
Bueno, gracias, profesores, por su participación tan dinámica. Ya finalizamos el webinar. Para las personas que no asistieron, ustedes coméntenles a través de sus grupos de WhatsApp que esta conversación va a estar subida en nuestra plataforma Google Classroom. Y nos vemos en el próximo webinar. Ya comencé a enviar itinerarios de vuelos de algunas personas, de vuelos nacionales, para que los revisen y hagan sugerencias sobre los mismos. Feliz día, profesores.